Hello and welcome to Olmsted, the Urbanist Podcast. I'm Ned Melanson. Today I'm speaking to Jesse Lang, and we're going to jump right into our conversation that Jesse and I were having about housing and health inequities in minority neighborhoods. We also cover mistaken beliefs surrounding housing market economics. The results might surprise you. New York City being a city of yes, Mayor Adams talking the talk but not walking the walk on housing, as well as climate resiliency and what draws Jesse to urbanism. Jesse lives and works in Manhattan in the health policy field and is also a housing advocate with the organization Open New York. Jesse and I began our conversation talking about how some communities are more successful than others in stopping highway expansions, paving down the middle of neighborhoods. And she gave the example of a successful movement in Manhattan, and that's where we'll pick up the conversation.
And actually, in fact, the highway that would have gone through Lower Manhattan would have actually gone directly through Washington Square Park, and in sort of a similar story, a relatively affluent, relatively white, kind of older neighborhood was able to successfully block it. And I think it really speaks a lot to how disproportionately certain communities are able to mobilize and fight against something. And those are the communities that tend to already have power, whereas the communities that historically don't have power, don't have access to resources, are the ones that are not successfully able to block things that are really damaging to their communities.
And then I think there's a kind of like almost a delicate debate right now amongst urbanist circles. Like, let's say you have a minority or lower socioeconomic neighborhood. It's very car dominated. They're subject to a lot of traffic violence, a lot of air pollution, health inequities. You want to improve these neighborhoods. You want to make them more walkable. You want to make them better transit access. But that can, by the people within that neighborhood, that can kind of seem like this outside influence and this outside change. You want to improve and help these places, but you don't want to have almost this like overbearing, outside, no, we know better kind of mindset.
Yeah, I think about that a lot, both with health policy and with a lot of the housing advocacy work that I do, because I'm a white woman, I have a lot of privilege relative to a lot of other people. And I also have been lucky to be able to choose where I live, and I haven't really been forced to live somewhere or, not like some people just don't have a choice as to where they live. And I do want to be really sensitive to the distrust that a lot of people have towards outsiders that come in and say, hey, here's a solution for you, because historically there have been a lot of examples of people doing that and it hasn't really gone so well. And I think that the trust has been broken a number of times. And for us as advocates and us who want to see a better world and might be aware of the solutions because of education or experience or just working towards those solutions, it is really incumbent upon us to listen to the communities that have historically been harmed and who really could potentially benefit from those solutions, but might have their own ideas about how to implement them, the change of pace that they want to see. And I really think that for any solution to be successful, whether it be getting people better access to healthcare, improving transportation, transit in a neighborhood, building more housing or building affordable housing, there is kind of a balance of needing buy-in and trust from a community. At the same time, there are also situations where sometimes city officials do kind of need to see the bigger picture. And I think that it is really a fine balance to strike, and is one that is very complicated.
Let's get into your housing advocacy work. Could you give us an overview of what you do in New York for housing advocacy?
Sure. So the organization that I work with is called Open New York. We are a pro-housing, we're a YIMBY organization for people who like that term.
Which stands for?
That stands for Yes in My Backyard, which is in opposition to the NIMBY movement, which stands for No in My Backyard or Not in My Backyard. And so really what we advocate for is more abundant housing as a pathway to more affordable housing. And that's based on market economics is kind of like at the core of what that means for us. But something that I really like about volunteering with Open New York is that we focus our work for rezonings and building more housing specifically on these high opportunity neighborhoods that have historically resisted development, tend to be more white, more wealthy. So, for example, one of our big successes last year was that Open New York was heavily involved in the Soho NoHo rezoning in downtown Manhattan. And this is a neighborhood that is majority white, is one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in New York City, and it is also one of the lowest density neighborhoods in Manhattan. That's something that we're building on. So we do fight for individual rezonings and individual projects to add more housing like that. We also look at larger policy goals like statewide legislation or citywide zoning changes that will make it easier to build housing on a larger scale, because fighting for the individual projects is an important part of what we do, but it certainly cannot be the only part of what we do. The other thing that I like about Open New York a lot is that we always fight for housing that is at the deepest possible levels of affordability using the tools that we have to create that, because we do recognize that even if we build all of the market rate housing that any developer could ever want to really saturate the market, it really still wouldn't be enough to help people who are at the lowest income levels or who are formerly homeless access the housing that they could afford.
If you could give us an idea of kind of the general debate around housing, because there are these terms YIMBY, NIMBY.
I think that whole argument, really, a lot of it stems from the people making those arguments are often homeowners. They often have generational wealth already through their homeownership. And not only do they have a vested interest in preserving their own property values, which is part of the reason why it is their prerogative to prevent additional development, because they worry that it will affect their property values, even if they won't tell you that directly. That is the truth. They also, I think, understandably don't want to see their community change and, say, hey, I've lived in this community for my whole life. It has been a certain density. It has a certain, we hear the term neighborhood character a lot. And I don't want that to change. And I think that on the surface, it's fine to feel that way. Change is hard and a lot of people don't like it. And it's a hard thing to embrace. But when you're talking about somebody who lives in Manhattan, who is unwilling to add additional housing or who is actively fighting to stop additional housing in their neighborhood, when historically the neighborhoods that have really been forced to build additional housing are the neighborhoods that are less affluent, have lower rates of home ownership, and are majority minority communities, it starts to be, you can start to see that it's a little bit unfair. And it's like, well, if you want to benefit from living in, I think, an amazing place like New York City, there has to be sort of we all have to contribute our part. And that's kind of where I think the opposition to that movement comes in, is to say, hey, those of you who have been blocking this development have a ton of privilege and have benefited a lot from where you live. And now it's time to start to give back to the city and to people who would like to live here in the future so that they can also access some of those similar benefits.
And I think they also hold a couple mistaken beliefs too, like the timelessness they think of their neighborhood, even though you look at any city, it's constantly a changing. Any place really is constantly changing. It's either developing, it's either booming, it's growing, it's decaying, it's rusting out, and so people think their neighborhoods are in these kind of standstill, oh, this is the perfect version of our neighborhood. The property values thing you mentioned, I think, is really important because people obviously see their homes as like a major asset, and they think that their housing values are going to decline. But with more dense and infill development, infill being, making a not so dense area denser, it can actually increase the value and the economic output of a certain area, and it can kind of raise the tide for
Yeah, I think
everybody.
that the fear that some homeowners have of depreciating property values in the face of new development often are not based in fact. It's, when I go to different hearings and community board meetings and things to advocate for new development, I really do hear a lot of misinformation, and it's it's hard for me to know what of the misinformation is kind of being spread on purpose or is just genuinely misunderstandings that people are not aware of. And I do think that the and I think that a lot of it is complicated as well. Talking about changing property values when you start to create more infill housing is complicated. It probably depends on the existing density of the neighborhood that you're talking about, the age of the existing housing stock that won't be replaced, and things like that. And there's a lot of research in this field, but there's also a lot of contradictions.
Like what?
Well, like one of the things is that people try to say that, and this is actually something that people in the that YIMBYs try to say a lot, is that if you build more housing, you're going to see rents go down, like market rents will go down. And the truth of that is that it's actually really complicated. You probably see the biggest effect in terms of downward price pressure and rents going down in a neighborhood in the places that have the highest rents and are what we term as the high opportunity neighborhoods of Soho and similar neighborhoods like that. But it's a little bit more complicated when you get into neighborhoods that have more low income people, a lot of people living below the poverty line. And it's a complicated story. And people will use examples of like different cities in California to say this is what we think would happen in New York City. And while I think that it's important to look at research and use data to make decisions, I think that it's also important to think critically about what are the differences between these places and how can we use this data to paint a more comprehensive picture so that we're not kind of creating these misleading claims, because people love to jump on those when you start to make them.
So your goal though, kind of regardless,
Yes.
is more housing.
Yeah, it
Is
is.
that
And
correct? It's more housing and like dot 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 like why do you want more housing?
so I mean, part of the reason is that we have a documented unmet need for housing in New York City. Our vacancy rate right now in New York City is below 5%, which our city says is a housing emergency. And that is much too low of a vacancy rate for people to have the freedom to move around.
And what's a
Sure.
vacancy
So
rate
it's
and why is it
it's the
significant?
percentage of units that are currently uninhabited, and that's at a snapshot in time. So that was the vacancy rate, I think, in the spring when the data was initially released. So at any given time, a certain proportion of New York City's rental stock is not going to have somebody living in it. But it's important that the vacancy rate be high enough that if somebody wants to move, that they are able to, and not only are able to move within New York City if they want to stay here. For me, I used to live in Brooklyn, but then got a job in Upper Manhattan, so didn't want to commute from Crown Heights, Brooklyn to Upper Manhattan. That was like an hour and 20-minute commute. It was important for me to be able to move into a vacant apartment when I did want to move. It's also important for people who want to come into New York City. And as I said, I've lived in New York City since 2015. And I moved here from a rural community where I didn't really have very much economic opportunity and have been able to really forge a path for myself that I think would not have been possible if I had stayed in my hometown. And that is something that I want other people to be able to access, but it is only possible for our city to keep growing if we build more housing. You know, people will always be moving into New York City, they will always be moving to other neighborhoods. And we don't want people to be displacing existing residents in the process or out competing those existing residents. So we want to make sure that there is enough housing in the most in-demand neighborhoods that we're not displacing the people who have lived there for a long time.
I think it sounds like what you're saying is like if we don't have this kind of slack in the housing stock, that kind of messes up everything. It messes up almost the entire economy in
Yeah,
some ways,
actually,
like the job
I
market.
saw a statistic recently. I think it was in a book that I was reading about. So cities really are the main driver of GDP in the United States. And there have been some estimates about the lost GDP in the United States, like lost potential GDP, specifically as a result of not meeting our city's housing needs. I don't remember what the figure was, but it was definitely in the billions at least. So quite a large number, but maybe the trillions. It just was really striking to me to think about not only are our cities major drivers of our economy, but they could be making our economy do even better than they have been.
Right. And by kind of going back to this YIMBY thing, it's like here's this kind of pot of gold, you know, that added economic benefit or economic loss, whatever way you want to look at it, you know, what we're losing. By catering to these entrenched concerns, our entire society is losing out.
That is definitely something that I think should draw concern from a lot of people at a lot of different levels of government.
But of course, it's hard. It's in everyone's interest, but in a very specific situation like one housing fight, you have some very entrenched interests. So that being said, do you want to get into a little bit, maybe in the specifics about this Soho advocacy work you did?
So yeah. Right now we're actually working on a rezoning in Throggs Neck, which is a neighborhood in the Bronx. It's called the Bruckner Sites rezoning. And this is a rezoning that would bring a fairly small number of housing units to a pretty low density neighborhood. It would bring about 340 new housing units to this neighborhood. But this is a neighborhood that has produced almost no new housing in the past decade and really is one of the lowest producers of affordable housing or income restricted housing in New York City. And so this is really an example of a neighborhood that has more homeowners than the average neighborhood in New York City, has more white residents, tends to be older, and is also a neighborhood where, quite frankly, people have families and then kids grow up and they can't afford to live in this neighborhood anymore, even if they wanted to, because there's just no housing available. And it's a neighborhood that has a lot of single family detached homes, which is not very typical of what we see in most of New York City. And the people who oppose this rezoning, which would, for the highest building, the tallest building that the rezoning would bring would be 8 stories, which in my opinion is quite modest, though I live in Manhattan, so maybe my opinion is a little bit skewed. But the people who are resisting this rezoning are saying things like, our neighborhood in the Bronx is a little slice of suburbia, and that's not something that we want to give up. We don't want it to change. But at the same time, there are real infrastructure issues in this neighborhood that is a neighborhood that has resisted growth. And in my opinion, when you embrace growth, our city is more willing to invest in the infrastructure of a neighborhood. And when you put up this resistance, it makes it hard for anything to change for the better. And the only thing that can happen when you resist change is decay. And so this has been a tough rezoning. We're sort of reaching the tail end of the process now, where the city council member kind of needs to make a decision about whether or not she's going to support it. And that will probably drive the entire city council saying whether or not they will support it. But it is one that has drawn a lot of attention from the city. Mayor Adams has said that he supports it because he thinks that neighborhoods that have historically resisted development should be saying yes. And he has this whole plan of like, we should be a city of yes. And so I think that it would be important for the neighborhood just because it would be a huge number relative to the housing that this neighborhood has produced historically. But I think it's also important symbolically because it really is going to set the tone of, are we a city that is going to meet the housing needs and say every single neighborhood needs to meet the housing needs of the city, or are we just going to continue with the status quo, which is neighborhoods get to control everything and say no, even if it would benefit the families that already live there.
So Throggs Neck is saying, "Oh, this is a little slice of suburbia," and
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, that's the problem. Like, you're in Brooklyn. You're in one of the biggest cities in the country. Brooklyn itself is
Yeah,
massive.
this is actually this is in the Bronx.
And then kind of like,
yeah.
Oh, this is in the Bronx. Sorry.
Yes.
Still another,
absolutely
large city by any means. And then like with the services too, it's like by them remaining not dense, low density, like they're a drain on the city's services because we have to run the sewer lines out there just like we have to do to the high density neighborhoods, but it serves a lower number of people. And do you have any thoughts on what Mayor Adams has done and what he said? I mean, it sounds like he's supporting this proposal, which is good.
That he, it is great that he is supporting this project. He has said a lot of different things in his time so far as mayor about what we need to do to meet the housing needs of New York City and also for how we can improve our city and make it more vibrant. My personal belief is that if he really wants to back up those claims with some real substance or back up what he is claiming to support, he really needs to put some money behind it. And what I've seen so far is that he really is actually trying to go in the other direction. He has said that every city agency needs to cut its budget by at least 7.5%. And it's hard for me to believe that we can achieve any sort of truly progressive vision if we aren't willing to spend money on it. And that is the reality. Progressivism costs money. It's kind of a hallmark of being a progressive. I consider myself very progressive and also very policy oriented. If I were to have a conversation with him and he were to be like, give me your recommendation about what you think we should do, I would think that the better pathway would be to increase our city's revenue so that you actually can spend money on these big things that our city really does badly need.
Big things like social housing or just kind of
infrastructure in general. Social housing, I think, would be amazing if we could pursue it. And that would require, if we wanted to do it at the city level, it would require a lot of financing for the HPD, which is sort of the housing department. And those are the people that give subsidies for income restricted housing, particularly if it's built on city owned land. And those are really where the opportunities for building these like social housing or 100% affordable housing present themselves, not the privately owned land that developers are looking to build upon. And HPD is an underfunded agency. It's also an agency that has a really high vacancy rate right now and is kind of losing a lot of very talented individuals. And those are the things that have real effects. I don't think that we could achieve a social housing future without also support from the state and really ideally the federal government, but it would be a start for the city to be financing these sorts of things. From the infrastructure perspective, though, we have a lot of neighborhoods that do have aging infrastructure, including aging sewage systems and like water runoff capture. And those are things that in the face of climate change and also wanting to allow growing communities, we would need to be thinking seriously about, and those are things that also cost a lot of money.
I count myself as a progressive too, and when you say it costs money, and it does, but I'm going to put the political spin on it and say they're investments for cost-saving measures rather than something expensive, even though we're saying the same thing. You mentioned climate change, and basically the bill is going to become due eventually, and how big we want that bill to be. Do we make these investments now? Do we make our communities more dense and more financially stable and, more environmentally resilient? Or do we kind of keep the status quo and then just
Yeah,
see
and I
what
think that what
happens?
we're seeing is particularly with climate change and the investments that we need to make on infrastructure upgrades, is that it's only becoming expensive every year that we put it off. And infrastructure costs in the United States, and New York City is no exception, are astronomically high compared to really a lot of the rest of the world. And it really is only becoming more expensive, both as a result of inflation and like other economic factors, but also just because the scale of the problems is getting bigger. So I totally agree with you that it's something that we really can't afford to continue putting off.
I do want to give you any space if there's anything we haven't covered, maybe about New York City or anything like that. So I'll give you the last few minutes for whatever you want to go off.
Sure. So when I was thinking about talking to you about this podcast, I was trying to think a lot about urbanism and what draws me to urbanism. And for anybody listening who is maybe questioning the value of urbanism or whether it's something that they should get more invested in, I would say yes, absolutely. For people who don't live in cities, visit cities. It's an amazing way to start to learn about what cities have to offer. I think that New York City is, I mean, we say it's the greatest city in the world. It is. That's not, that's true. But
Is that a scientific fact, or is that an opinion? Okay.
But, cities are, it's the people in cities that makes them special. And every city has kind of a different character and a different sort of culture associated with them. And maybe the reason why everyone who lives in New York City says it's the best city in the world is because we have the right culture fit. But there is something really special with, we were talking about agglomeration a little while ago, and there is something really special that happens when people come together. And for anybody who thinks that people who live in cities aren't nice, I always tell people that New Yorkers are kind but not nice, because maybe we don't have the time to be nice in the moment. But I do think that New Yorkers and city dwellers in general really are kind and do have a really special connection with one another.
All right, that was Jessie Lang, Policy Pro, YIMBY, Certified Progressive, and of course, housing advocate with Open New York. Open New York is an awesome organization fighting both at the ground level and the policy level for more housing. So we'll be sure to talk to Jessie again, as the housing crisis is going to be a pressing issue in the coming decades. Plus, if you like this discussion, consider joining the Olmsted Slack community, where we swap ideas on urbanism, engage in friendly debate on which type of bike lane is best, and share calls to action to get active on the ground. Check us out at www.olmsted.city. That's www.olmsted.city. It's free, and there are already some of the top thinkers and doers that are members. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.